have a preference?
Thanks, mate. Oh, I don't have a preferred seat, no.
Okay, well, I'll go
sit
around.
here. You go
I'll
there.
go
I'll
there.
here.
Good evening. Oh, thank you. Good evening, and thank you. I'd like to thank you all for joining us here at Kooyong NDIS Forum. My name is Monique Ryan. I'm the local federal member for Kooyong. And before I say anything else, I would just firstly like to acknowledge the fact that we are standing, I'm standing or sitting this evening on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and that this is land that was never ceded to us. And without wanting to put in a political note to the evening's activities, I hope that this is a part of the world which will give the traditional owners of this country a voice in the forthcoming referendum. I'd like to welcome this evening the Federal Member for Maribyrnong and the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, Bill Shorten, and thank him very much for his great generosity with his time in attending tonight. I've learnt in the last 18 months or so that being a politician is actually a busy life, and I know I have some insight, although obviously not a member of the government, into how hard the ministers work when they're in government. I have to say that as a newly elected member as an independent, Minister Shorten has been incredibly generous with his time and very supportive in the last 18 months as I and other new independent members have learnt the ropes of how to be parliamentarians and how to try to support our communities and provide them with what they need from us, particularly with some of the more complicated social services like the NDIS, aged care, childcare and the like. I'll just cover some housekeeping and then give you an idea of how we're going to proceed this evening. The first thing to say is that at the moment now, if you wanted to access them, or throughout the evening, there are representatives from the National Disability Insurance Agency in the foyer who are here to assist you with your queries and with questions, and who will be here immediately after this event as well. I also have members of my team and some volunteers who are here, and I'll just get them to stand up and wave if I could. So up the back here, thank you. Number of volunteers who are here. If you need help with anything throughout the evening, please just put up your hand or indicate to us, and we'll give you what assistance we can. And I'm very grateful to them for coming out tonight as well. I do want everyone to be aware that the hall, I think, will fill up. I know there's some issues with parking outside, but we also have people attending this evening on live stream. So this event is being streamed live, and everyone who's here in person or on the live stream has an opportunity to submit questions via Slido. So we do have a number of questions which have been submitted by attendees here this evening, and we'll be going through those first. But you also have an opportunity to submit questions via Slido, which we will see on a screen that we have here. How you do that is basically just search Slido on the web browser on your phone, and then or www.slido.com, and then enter the code 1179376. If you don't have that code, or if you're having issues with Slido, put up a hand and one of us will come around and give you a bit of a help with that. Or you can always just put your hand up at the end of the evening and we'll take questions as we can. So the National Disability Insurance Scheme, most of you probably know it better than I do. It was interesting, this year celebrating the 10th year of the scheme. And we were just, in the last couple of days, reviewing what we've experienced with the NDIS in the Kooyong electorate office in the last year. And we've received about 66 approximately NDIS-related inquiries, so about one a week comes into our office, and that's usually people having issues with their plan or having issues with reviews for their plan. There are 2,349 NDIS participants in Kooyong, out of a total of 610,000 odd nationally, which means that Kooyong actually has below average NDIS participation, interestingly. Interestingly, there are more providers than participants in this electorate. That more than 2,500 NDIS providers, and I know some of you are here this evening. In terms of the issues that people have brought to our attention, and which we'll discuss this evening and have an opportunity to discuss with the Minister, probably the biggest one has been the accessibility of the NDIA to them. We've also heard about people who feel that their care needs are not currently being supported by the system, which includes people with autistic spectrum disorders and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We've heard issues around transparency with planning decisions, issues around concerns about fraud, and we had one major fraud notification which we passed on to the NDIS just after the last election actually. Issues around funding for care in group homes and funding for assisted technology, non-standard items and for therapies. And these are all things I hope that we will touch on this evening. So first off, we're going to hear from the Minister for about 10 to 15 minutes. Subsequent to that, we will have an opportunity to talk about the questions that we've already had submitted. And then at about 7:45, so in about half an hour, we'll go to questions from the floor. Just indicate if you need any help at any point, and I'll hand over now to Minister Shorten. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's fantastic to see so many people here and no doubt people online. It's great for me to cross the river. Of course, during COVID, I didn't get over this side of Melbourne very often, but I appreciate Monique stamping my passport and allowing me to come and visit Kooyong. First of all, I too would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Aboriginal land, and I too acknowledge elders who may be here, past, present and emerging. And one way I'm going to pay respect to our Indigenous heritage is by voting yes in the upcoming referendum, and I'd encourage people to do that. The Constitution was written in the 1890s. It was never intended to be a frozen document in time. The constitutional founding fathers, they were all blokes then, put in mechanisms to change it. So I think updating the nation's birth certificate to include our first Australians is sensible, and the prospect of asking people about decisions before we make them is a very sensible and modest proposition. But enough of that, you'll get more of that in the next couple of months. We're here to talk NDIS. I'd also, though, like to acknowledge the work of Dr. Monique Ryan. It's not often in federal politics you get a candidate who becomes a member who's so highly qualified. And the work she's done at the Murdoch Institute is outstanding. So she serves on the Joint Standing Committee of the NDIS, and I always take her observations with great weight, largely because in many aspects of, say, paediatrics, she's the expert and I'm the student. So it's great that you've got her here, and I think for those who are interested in the NDIS, she's an asset not only here but nationally. So having acknowledged Monique, let's talk briefly about the NDIS from my perspective. I'm very lucky to be the NDIS Minister. I think it's a great privilege. In the way of the universe is not always predictable. But I remember I got elected 5 terms ago in the end of 2007 when I was a baby, and Kevin Rudd gave me a junior ministry. It was Disability Services. And I thought, having been a union rep, I'd seen disadvantage and unfair treatment, but nothing prepared me for the second-class status that people with disability and their carers were accorded in Australia. That takes nothing away from their personal accomplishment, effort or achievement. But it was almost like the scales dropped from my eyes, and that I realised that people with disability were living in a virtual exile right around us, and that everything from birth to death and everything in between was just harder. Now, disability is a fact of life. You can get it at birth, where you have a different journey than the one which is the standard journey. You can acquire it in the blink of an eye, you can acquire it sporting, or just acquire it through the onset of ageing. That's not actually the major problem. The major problem is that in this country, we had a system which was crisis-ridden. And it was the barriers that the community put in front of the person which with the disability, which actually is the, I think, the issue. And of course, this is a general analysis of life, but a lack of money and a lack of power is a general problem, and that describes what happens with disability. So the way that resources used to be allocated before the NDIS was not by either socialism or capitalism. It was allocated by crisism. The worse off you were one day and the worse you were off the next day, the more likely you get to the front of the queue for service. Now that is a bad way to do business. That's a bad way to treat people. I think every Australian's got the right to a fulfilling life. So we came up with the idea in that first term of creating what I think's, I know it's unique in the world, but I think it's sort of unique in Australian politics in the 21st century. It's the idea of almost the sort of, to be simplistic, a left idea that you get packages of support, not just rations, but a demand-driven package based on need. And if you like the simplistic notion, the conservative view is that you let the individual allocate the resources rather than a large system. So individual packages. I think that's the right way to go. And then we created it between 2010 and 2013. Then, just as we were creating it, Labor lost, and we had 9 years of the coalition. Then, as the way of the universe comes, having helped create it, I've now got to come back and see how we can make it work to purpose. So I do think it's a privilege. The NDIS is changing lives every day. It is remarkable. When it works well, it works really well. But it hasn't been a consistent experience. And so what we want to do is, what the government's been doing is, first of all, trying to rebuild some trust. And we want to work out how we can improve the system, and then we've got a review being handed down in 2 months' time. What I was hearing as the shadow spokesperson on NDIS is that you could go into a planning meeting, and a great meeting, but then you get the plan and you feel like you've got someone else's plan. What we're hearing is that it becomes almost a second full-time job, just dealing with the inputs to the system. What we hear is that you deal with someone one day, and then 3 months' time, you'll be dealing with someone else. And you've got to keep telling your story again. What we're hearing is that every 12 months, it was almost like the hamster wheel. You get your package, month 10, 11, 12, you've got to make sure you spend your money so you get the same money, and it's just a very introspective internal focus. What we're hearing is that some service providers, and by the way, the vast bulk of service providers do a magnificent job, but some, we're hearing, when you say that they ask you, do you have an NDIS package? If you say yes, bang, up goes the price. What we're hearing is the same with AT. So it needs consistency, it needs a vision. So since we've come in, without sort of blowing our own trumpet too much, some of the things we've done is we've tried to reduce the average waiting time in hospital. What we were finding was that people eligible for NDIS and fit for discharge from hospital in Victorian hospitals before the last federal election, on average, were waiting 160 days from eligible for discharge to be able to discharge with your plan sorted. And it's the same all around the country. We've now reduced that waiting time to 27 days. Now that's an average, so there's some longer, but that's great. Hospital's not where you want to be if you don't need to be there. We found there were 4,500 matters in the AAT. That's the court system where you appeal administrative decisions. We made a decision to blitz the waiting lists, to bring in expert conciliators with knowledge of disability. We've now resolved 85% of those matters. So of the big long queue of long-standing matters in the courts 15 months ago, it's been reduced by 85%. Now, of course, some people now go to the AAT because it's quicker to sort it out there now under us than it used to be just sorting it out beforehand. So we've got to improve the earlier decision-making process. We want to have more people with lived experience in leadership. So the NDIS is overseen by a board and appointed by a mixture of the federal government and the states. It now has 6 out of 12 of its directors are people with lived experience of disability, including the chair, Kurt Fernley, who's just a remarkable Australian. The agency, we wanted to improve the agency. The agency, I think, had become very defensive in the last 9 years through a series of decisions, mistakes they'd made perhaps, but also just budget cuts and so forth. Of the 11 most senior people in the agency when I became minister, there's one left. So it's been a turnover of people. and there's more people with lived experience of disability in the leadership than ever before. Something like 17% of the agency are people with disabilities. But another problem which we encountered, so we've done those first things. Oh, the other thing we did is we've set up what we've called a fraud fusion task force. So we get some AFP resources, we talk to tax, they didn't always used to do that, track the payments. So now we've got 44 criminal matters under investigation, 16 of which are in the courts for prosecution, and we've got another 14 matters which are in the preliminary stages of investigation. So it is a fact that wherever there's government money in Australia, ever since the Rum Corps, people will look to try and siphon some of that money off for themselves rather than goes to where it's meant to go. These are things we've done, but what they're about is not just the individual issues, it's about saying to people, we hear you and we want you to have some renewed trust. Now, what we did in the last budget is that we've actually, in an otherwise difficult budget, we got hundreds of millions of extra dollars for the NDIA. For one reason, a lot of the issues in the NDIS to make it work better start from the first decision. If your first plan's wrong, then you spend a lot of time rebuilding that aeroplane in flight. And as the metaphor indicates, not the way you'd like to do it. So we want to build agency capability. But get this, my predecessors in about 2017 had 4,000 people working at the agency for about 170,000 participants. Now there's 600,000 participants, or there were about 560,000 participants when we took over. They still had 4,000 people working in the agency. What a recipe for failure. There's no insurance company in Australia doesn't run admin costs of 10 cents in every dollar of benefits paid. But the agency was running on 3.5 cents admin for every dollar paid out, which means you're getting rushed decisions, you're getting a big turnover, we're relying too much on labour hire. Just, get this, the call centre is a contracted call centre, so they're contractors, fine people contractors, but they couldn't access in some cases. So you ring up the call centre with your complaint, they would have to take your name and then they have to forward it on to the agency to sort out because they're not allowed to access the file. Like, how do we invent double handling? Like, just hats off. Like, no doubt some consulting group got paid a lot of money to come up with that inefficient system, but that's another story. So we're bringing a lot of jobs in-house again, but we're offering some of those jobs to the same people who are contracted because, there's dignity and we want to give people a chance to work. So we're hiring hundreds of new people in the agency. And we want to build capability. I want you to be able to talk about a matter to someone at the other end who knows what you're talking about. And this is not rocket science, but it sounds revolutionary, doesn't it? So we're investing in capability. We're investing more in the clamping down on unethical practices. One of the things which, I'm sort of driving my office to distraction. I should say we've also got a review coming in October, and I'll come to that and we'll open up for questions. But other measures we're doing in the interim, we're going to move to a default position, longer plans. Now, some plans should be, they can be by the nature of the person's disability or the child, whatever they're at. A year's fine. But for a lot of the conditions that we've got on the scheme, it's not going to change year in, year out. In fact, most of them aren't going to change. If you're blind, you're still blind, you know the story, but it's dehumanising, you have to keep repeating. First of all, commissioning reports, bang, that's a cost. The people doing them, whilst I don't mind getting paid for doing the reports, it's not really what they went into practice for, at least not the good ones. But also, it just creates tension. Also, if you spend all your time looking inwards at the plan, you're not really getting out in your community. If you're worried that something's going to be chopped all the time, but moving to default longer plans, we're doing co-design with participants, doesn't mean if there's a change in your circumstances, there's a change. It's not set, it's not sort of set and forget, but what we do want to do is stop bothering you unless you need to raise an issue. So we're running out some of those changes now. We're certainly also right at the moment looking at how we do our supported independent living packages. That's one of the big ticket items in the scheme. It's probably heading towards $8-9 billion at the moment. And we've got to make sure that we're actually giving people, about 20 to 25,000 people are the recipients of that. We want to make sure that they're getting the proper care, that they're in the right accommodation. And so we think, and I don't have all the answers, we don't have all the answers on it, but it's not quite working the way it was intended. So we're really trying to sit down with participants, with service providers, and nut out how we can do that better. So the housing piece is underway, we're working on that. But then we get to this review in October. Now, in the fine print of the NDIA and the NDIS is the fact it's a state-federal combination. Whilst that's good in that it makes it hard for a barbaric government to chop it to bits, it does also mean that you've got to get everyone to agree. So you can see as a defence mechanism, good. As a mechanism for making change, it's a little more complicated. And the review, so I'm off to Darwin tomorrow. We're meeting with all of the states and territories to talk about where this review could be headed. The review is chaired by two people, Lisa Paul and Bruce Bonahay. Bruce is a local in Kooyong, very smart man. I've worked with him for a long time. We've got people with lived experience and a range of experts on the panel. And what we're looking at is the following questions. Clarifying eligibility, determining what reasonable and necessary means, having a look at what we're doing for kids, and making sure we're also having a look at what's the world outside the NDIS for people with disability. So there are a range of the issues. We also want to look at how the market's actually operating and what we're doing to make sure that it's working in the interests of participants. So those big, meaty topics. If you like, the way we've approached reform is we pick some important issues, but more singular issues like hospitals and the court cases. We're moving towards building the agency capability and cracking down on the fraud and unethical behaviour. And now we're going to what I think is the sort of inner tier or the issues which really go to making sure that people have a consistent, transparent, accountable experience with the NDIS. So the attitude of this government and myself is the NDIS is here to stay. My attitude is that it remains a demand-driven scheme, universal. There are competing narratives for reform. One narrative for reform is what I would class as the traditional neoconservative view. Cap it, co-pay it, means test it, put it in a corner and ignore it. That's not reform. That's saying actually we can't run the scheme, so we'll just try and corral it. Then there's sort of like the ultra left-wing view, which says you can't touch anything in the scheme, and anything you do means that it's a savage attack on the rights of people on the scheme. It's not. That's the tyranny of low expectations too. We all know the scheme can be run better. So the test, my guiding motif on the scheme is, on any decision we make, is this in the best interest of the participant? Like, it's not a particularly complex test. Is this in the best interest? Are we making sure that every dollar is getting through to the people for whom the scheme was designed? Now, I think that happens to then address the issue of sustainability. A lot of talk about the growth. The scheme is growing more rapidly than it should. But I think whatever attempts, such as they were about reform in the last few years, have been pretty simplistic. It said, oh, well, we'll just try and cap everyone's package in some form or another. That's not the answer. The answer is to run it in the best interest of the participant, and I think we will eliminate a lot. And if we run it more equitably, more efficiently, more transparently, with more co-design, I think you get to the right outcomes. What's driving at the scheme at the moment is nearly half the people on the scheme are kids. Now, their packages are not expensive on average, so let me be clear. But over time, you've got to ask yourself, are kids being referred to the NDIS because it's the only thing going? And my answer is yes. Another driver is, of course, just getting the accommodation piece right, the one-to-one care proposition. What does that mean? What does that look like? I also think eliminating some of the waste and overcharging, you know, the price gouging, I think is a big area. I think agency capability is an important part of stopping some of the dysfunction. So we've got the report coming down in October. Now I'd like to, through Monique's capable hands and her very capable team, we're interested to have the discussion, hear the questions. What I've tried to do is tell you where I'm coming from, what we've done, what we hope to do, and my ultimate goal is that the scheme can be politician-proof, that it can't be subject to the changing whims and electoral fortunes of who's either NDIS literate and likes it or who thinks it's, you know, neither this nor that. But the way we do that, and I say this to everyone in the disability community, and that, like it or not, you're all in that because you wouldn't be here if you weren't, is we must get our house in order so no one else can be given the permission to come in and sort it out for us. We do it together, and I'm sure we'll make... I want the scheme to be the best in the world. And I think that's entirely within the intellect, the compassion and the brains of all of us. Over to all of you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Minister. Can you hear me okay? Is that... Okay, great. I've got a list of questions here which we've synthesised from the many questions which were sent in before this evening, and thank you for those of you who've done that. So I'm going to try and... Oh, yes. So the Slido code is 1179376. Cheers. So I'm going to try and put them in a sort of order, which is a bit arbitrary, but I'll go through... I'm not going through them in the order in front of me, but just in something that seems logical. Provider fees.
Yeah.
They're pretty significant.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, Minister, that very often it feels like people jack them up if they know that you're on the NDIS. Are they being reviewed?
Do you want to answer that now? No, I just thought maybe we'd do a group of questions, but, you know,
this is a summary of a number of different questions.
Fees are set by the NDIS board. One model which is under contemplation is going to an independent pricing mechanism, because some service providers say that they feel that the price decisions are a bit arbitrary. So that's one thing, that's a potential ball in play. But going to the issue of other issues of fees, since we've been elected, we've had 2 rounds of price increases. We've passed on all of the pay rises to disability support workers straight away, and that's fair enough. But there's been some frustration from allied health professionals who we've frozen their fees for 2 years. But I would say 2 things back to that. One is the fees for statutory schemes are amongst the highest already, so the hour. And whilst the fee is a maximum, we find in most jurisdictions around Australia, nearly the maximum's getting charged. To be fair though to some of those doing it in that area, I accept that we can try and reduce some of the mindless report writing and some of the red tape regulation. I have a personal view, and it's only my opinion at this point, but why are we asking all the allied health professionals to sort of do audits and registration for the NDIS scheme when, if they're already registered with a professional statutory scheme, why are we duplicating? And I think that at least, you know, that helps take out some of the red tape. I mean, we would probably have a practice guide, which is right. If there's a failure to follow the practice guide, well, that's not good. But what we would do is sorry, I didn't realise my phone was on. That would be a disaster in Parliament. Monique would point it out to me too. So allied health professionals, we think if we can take some of the red tape, that's a plus for them. But the statutory scheme of fees is amongst the best across a dozen state and federal statutory schemes. Where I probably am most focused about fees, though, is I want to have a chilling effect on price gouging. So Jim Chalmers has taken a great interest in this with me, and I've been meeting directly with the ACCC and the National Disability Insurance Agency, and I've sort of laid out a challenge to the ACCC. Can they come up with a regulation which makes it illegal? See, people don't park in disabled car spots, but you also get a fine if you do. So most of us don't park in a disabled car spot because, frankly, you just wouldn't do it. But the fact is there is also a fine there, which I didn't know, but there is. What we need to do is to say that not only is it uncool to have a dual, what we call a wedding tax. You know, when a couple turn up and say we're getting married, all of a sudden everything's more. There's a bit of an NDIS wedding tax out there. So we want to create an ACCC reg which just outlaws it. And if I can pull that off, we will have a great effect on price. Well, I think we will have a good impact on prices. It's always good to have a relative in the audience. So there's some of the things we're doing on pricing.
Yeah, great. No, you can't have a question now. That will completely subvert the process.
Oh, you're a
Well, I'll let you have
in the
a
western
question.
suburbs, they'd be ripping the chairs out if we could.
You're going to be throwing them at me. All right, I'll come back. I promise. Okay, I'm just because some of these are support. A few people have asked the same sort of question, so I think it's important that we try and cover them. A number of people have expressed concerns about support coordinators and local area coordinators, and particularly about the fact, and I have experienced this myself in the past, that at times they will override the reports and recommendations of medical practitioners when it appears, at least at some time, on occasion, that they perhaps have less insight into the medical conditions that they're assessing. I'm seeing some nodding of heads. So the question is, why do we spend money on getting reports and recommendations if they're not going to be followed? And what is the accreditation process, the quality monitoring for the support coordination providers? And are they regulated by a professional body and held to a standard?
No, they're not.
Well,
Okay.
There was a Dorothy Dixer, we call that, yes.
A bit of the history about local area coordinators and support coordinators. And at first, I should say, the very first thing I say is there's some great ones. You get a great LAC or a great support coordinator, brilliant. And there's doing some really heroic work. So the nature, of course, when we talk about a category of work is the generalisation's unfair because there's really good ones. But there is a long tail. The reason why we even have them, though, even when we get into what they can do and can't do, should and shouldn't do, you've got to ask, why do they exist? And what happened is it goes back to this staff cap. So what they did, because the previous government had an ideological objection to public servants and the agency increasing, then we've done all these engineered workarounds. So we've seen a profusion of partners in community, a profusion of support coordinators, a profusion of local area coordinators. When we were conceiving of the original scheme, I really had a view there were two functions. One function was to set up that initial plan and budget, and then you'd have someone who'd help you navigate it. How's the community work? And I got that part of the idea from, I worked on the terrible Black Saturday bushfires up in 2009. Remember all those people, I mean, it was shocking death, but there were thousands of houses burnt to the ground. And from Kinglake down to Labatouche and the Valley, St Andrews, Flowerdale, you'd meet people who didn't know where to start again. And oh my Lord, you've got to deal with local government, state government, federal government, different departments. So we gave every 30 or 40 families as part of the reconstruction a case manager. Just someone to help you. Because some days you're just on the phone to too many people and you just want to poke your eye out with a school pencil, because it's just so infuriating. So I really thought we would have someone help set up your plan, your budget, and then someone to be on that journey with you to get the best out of it. But instead we've got a profusion of titles. You've got plan managers, you've got they get to charge you for moving your invoices around the system. So the problem is, I think, the initial function. So if we haven't got the right design, then you're starting to try and retrofit a bad design. I think the agency needs to build up its capability, and then you've got someone at the agency you can talk to. You don't have to tell your story to. But I think there is a role for a sort of a navigator in the system. Whether or not that's the agency or a not-for-profit doing that, it's okay. But there need to be people who know disability. And not just people who tell you how to game your invoices, but people who can say, okay, the council's got these activities. This is where your local disability employment service is. This school has got a better rep for, kids, helping kids with disability. This is a better taxi service. What you want is someone, and when you get forms, you want someone to say, oh, that's Form X or that's Form Y. Just take the pressure off. Not make the job a second job being in the NDIS. So I think if we get the design right, then we can offer meaningful careers. The other thing is the turnover in people is very high. So I think if you can give people a career in disability, but I think it's having clarity about what the role is. Get that plan and budget right to begin with, then someone who helps you navigate the system. And the navigator, the case manager, the support coordinator, the PA. It isn't just about learning how to get your next amount of money out of the NDIS. It's telling you how to live in your community. There's a lot of parents whose kids are getting a bit of, support for speech pathology or OT. But what they would equally benefit from, or even more, is to be joined up with other parents who got kids in comparable situations. There is nothing more liberating than being able to talk to some other families who understand what you're going through. So parent-to-parent groups, play groups. We never aim to privatise the care of people to one-to-one care or provide adult therapies to kids. You want your kid to have friends. You want them to be able to have adventures and have experiences. So that's where I want my support coordinator / navigator / PA, knowing what's happening and building that. So I think if we got the design right and you can provide a good career track but a clear function for them, I think that starts to weed people, and there are a lot of people come in with the best of intentions. We've got to have better training for people. We need national worker accreditation. If you're going to be delivering services, there's a whole debate going on between registered and unregistered. Now, I get why we have a lot of unregistered providers, because frankly, the registration process is pretty cumbersome, and it seems to treat everyone as if they're Scope or Urella. If you're a sole trader, or if, it's not realistic. Also, I worry about with registration, the current system, that we're asking people, the big services, to measure the stuff that doesn't matter as opposed to the stuff that really does matter. So I think we need to consider a graduated system where if it's low risk activity, then you really don't have to jump through a lot of hoops. As I said, with allied health professionals, if you're already registered and you're professionally accredited, okay, well, within reason that should do. So it's about a skilled workforce as well. But I think agency capability, clear role function, would, I think, sort out a lot of the frustration of this sort of planner lottery, support coordinator lottery, local area coordinator lottery, if you get what I mean.
Agreed. I guess if I was going to say anything to that, it would be really with those navigators. I've often seen that for people coming from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, that they're challenging them to negotiate the system, but also sometimes challenging to disclose the nature of your family member's disability to their own community, and struggles with that sort of thing. And it would be very nice if the navigators, in some instances, came from.
We're finally now setting up, everything's got to be co-designed, and I take that as a given. It's quite ironic arguing about a voice, which is you talked about, but in disability, there should be nothing about us without us. I accept that view of the world. It's the way I look at the world. But we've called communities. We're now, in the last 15 months, engaging a lot more, and the agency's got to do more outreach. Just saying go to the portal is not necessarily a strategy. It's a bit of a cop-out sometimes. And also having things in language is important. And we've got to do a lot more outreach. So we just set up the other day, and I've got 5 NDIS staff here tonight. One of the ladies, Cassie, was here the other day. There's a lot of homeless people who frankly are eligible for the NDIS because of their conditions, but they've got no hope of filling in a form or coming into an office. So we've now set up our first outreach for the salvos at the top of Burke Street at their Project 614, and frankly, again, this isn't rocket science. It should just be done.
Thank you. We've received a number of questions about lack of access to support for psychosocial disabilities relative to other disability. So in the September 2022 quarter, 49% of applicants with a psychosocial disability were granted access to the scheme as compared to 77% of other applicants. It's obviously, we know that for many people it's difficult to access psychosocial supports external to the NDIS due to either financial constraints or just difficulty finding a therapist. So what are your thoughts about psychological or psychosocial support and its provision via the NDIS?
Well, at the founding of the NDIS, there was a discussion about if people with mental illness should be included in the scheme. I absolutely said they should. For me, the diagnosis is relevant, but it's not crucial. It's how your impairment affects your daily living. And you can have a psychosocial condition which is sufficiently serious, you do need help. So 10% of the people on the scheme have a dominant diagnosis of psychosocial. That's not how they get on the scheme, but that happens to be a major attribute they have as part of them being on the scheme. The 12% of the scheme goes to them. So to put in other words, about $4.5 billion in payments, which is about $40,000 for those of you who didn't have a grandfather who used to bet at the Caulfield Racecourse, but I already knew that number. So it's not a bar to being on the scheme. The real problem, in my opinion, is that when we were getting matching funding from the states and the federal government, they bundled up a series of community health, mental health programs into the scheme. But what it meant is that there's 250,000+ Australians who've got quite serious mental illness, but not sufficiently serious that it's a daily impairment, and there's nothing for them. So what's happening is you've got the way we deliver mental health services in this country. I mean, this could be a whole forum in itself, and it's not my portfolio, but I see it enough to have a view. An emergency ward at a hospital is not enough, but that's often where they go. Psychiatrist books are filled up, and psychologist books, there's waiting lists. And the talking well isn't necessarily a way to solve everyone's mental illness challenge. So, you know, I see the only path in the future is creating community mental health teams in clinics which are accessible, where people can go to. We've done that a little bit with Headspace and Origin for kids, but for adults in particular, there is just a desert. Not everyone's meant to be in the NDIS, and we can't, that's not what it's for. But if you imagine, if you like, 3 levels of support for disability in this country, the highest level would be the individual support of the NDIS. But then we've got what I would call foundational supports. They can be help for general supports for people with disability, which is not so serious they're in the scheme, but there's help. And there can also be specific foundational help for specific groups, such as community mental health. And then there's the first layer of help for disability in Australia, which is mainstream inclusion. That's your building standards, that's, you know, that's a commitment in the Education Act to fund disability in schools. So there's 3 levels of support for disability. What's happened is we've been quite successful at building up the NDIS. So why wouldn't you want to try and get into that if there's nothing else? So part of the challenge is to build a general attitude about disability in Australia where you are included. So I think that's probably where we've got to go in mental health, but psychosocial doesn't mean you're excluded. I can't speak to an individual case about a rejection, but I think part of the answer is what works, and there's a lot of innovation out there. So we've got to sit down and talk to my friends at the state governments, and when I use the word friends, it's easy for me to get on with a teal than the state governments, because was it Keating who said don't get between a premier and a bucket of money? And that's fair, they've got their cost base. You know, to be fair though, I shouldn't be too smart. The feds, we get the bulk of tax revenue in Australia ever since World War II, but nonetheless, anyway, that's a whole constitutional issue. But the answer on mental health is we need to have, I think, more supports outside the NDIS, which is a new way of delivering it because there's been a desert created.
Oh, I'm going to go there. You probably knew this was going to come. ADHD and autistic spectrum disorders. What's your take on those being within the NDIS and I guess the budgetary implications of including patient? I think I know what you're going to, well, I do know what you're going to say, but about the ASDs and ADHD being within the NDIS.
There's about, of the 600,000 or so people on the scheme, 230,000 have a primary diagnosis of autism. So it is the fastest growing group. And amongst kids, it is the really fastest growing group. Now, there's several things at work here. I am supportive, absolutely, of people with significant autism being on the scheme. no question, and that's not going to change. I think that when we talk about early intervention, and again, we've got, you know, a real expert sitting next to me, so I feel vaguely precocious now. I do realise being a minister doesn't actually, it's not like a brain transplant, you know, when you've got smart people. I'm not sure all the previous coalition ministers realise that, but that was a cheap shot. Forgive me. But we need to be better with childhood developmental delay. Beautiful babies are born, some journeys are standard, some are non-standard. We're seeing a lot of cutting-edge research in this country, but it's being mirrored around the world. The earlier that we can diagnose developmental delay, the more options we've got, the more we can sort of dive into it and give these kids a chance to engineer around depending on their conditions and help them learn. I personally favour that just when we have, you know, a children's journey with immunisations, leave aside the anti-vaxxers here, that's just I haven't got time, but you know, when we get kids immunised, we should be doing developmental delay checks. And I think that just means, what that means then is the earlier we can diagnose, it just gives us more options, and it means that at 3 and at 4 and at 5, you've got more off-ramps than just the NDIS. So I think that's part of it, and we need to work with the states. I know there's a lot of research going on, and to some extent my fairly simplistic politician's take on it doesn't do full credit to the years of research and the brilliance behind it. But so I think that's part of the challenge, giving kids options and giving families options. I think the other thing is that if we do a bit more analysis of how we do NDIS for kids, we never intended to replace families. Families don't want their kids to be on a lifetime government support scheme in many cases. But if that's where you're going to get your speech pathology or your OT or your psych, you'll do what it takes. I understand that. So I think that we've got to make the scheme for kids a lot more family-centric. Parents are like, it's not easy being a parent. And we're just looking for resources, we're looking to compare experiences, and then you're dealing with the school system, and that can be a lottery too. So, I don't think diagnosis should automatically get you on the scheme. As for ADHD, I don't support that just being a ticket into the scheme. I'm sort of butting heads a bit with the Green political party on that, who say it should just get you on the scheme. One, the scheme can't afford it, but more than that, I don't think just a diagnosis in itself, in most cases, is enough to necessarily justify the significant intervention of the NDIS. But we've got to provide a much better support system for early childhood intervention. So I think that's the sweet spot. Yeah.
Great. I'm going to ask 2 more questions and then we'll go to the floor. And I have been trying to cover the ones on Slido as well. So the first one is about support for older people. So obviously at this point, if you turn 65 and you're on the NDIS, you can elect to stay on it. But older people who are, well, I guess there's a few questions here. The first is people who are older but under 65 and are feeling that they get perhaps less support than younger people with disabilities. But also whether the question is that rather than expecting aged care to pick up disability care in people aged over 65, shouldn't the NDIS just cover all people who are living with a disability regardless of their age?
When we established the scheme when it was finally legislated, when we were campaigning from 2008 on the scheme, disability, as I said, was funded by crisis. The worse tomorrow was going to be than today, the more likely you could get to the front of a queue, which we all agree is a terrible way to allocate resources. So I used to look over the proverbial political fence. There were aged care assessment teams, there were packages for individuals, there was support from the delivered home. I thought, why is it that my peeps in disability get this block funding through large charities, but aged care seem to have more individualisation? Of course, though, times have changed. The NDIS is now more generous than aged care. You know, we've had 10 years of real drift, and but when we were setting it up, we saw a system that should be early intervention for kids. We have our NDIS, and aged care looks after the over 65s. Now, we've made all the exemptions to the human rights ledge because there was a system of support for an Australian no matter what their age. The problem is that aged care has slipped back, in my opinion, and NDIS, for all its imperfections, has moved forward. But the scheme can't take everyone with a disability over 65. Like, there's 4 million plus people with a disability, but nearly half of them are over 65. So if you think that the Fin Review and the Oz are having a heart attack about the NDIS now, you'd need to call a MICA unit to their editorial board if we... It's just, I'm being realistic. But that, I'm not going to try and tell you that that's all fair. So I think there's no doubt a discussion in aged care. There is a particular cost of disability which is not just associated with ageing. So we are doing a whole lot of reforms in aged care, but we have no plans at this stage to include people who acquire their disability over 65. I think, though, there is common ground to be made. Aged care has a Quality and Safeguards Commission. NDIS has a Quality and Safeguards Commission. 70 to 80% of the people who work in NDIS also work in aged care. So I think there's synergies for improving the quality of care, the workforce, safety, regulation by working together. I also think that when home and community living packages for some older Australians, I think will be options for people on the NDIS. So, you know, over time, I think part of the disjuncture will gradually merge, but I cannot say to you, and I won't make a promise that we'll change the eligibility, age eligibility, because it's just, I'm a politician who believes in taking risks, and I'm sure you've forgiven me for franking credits, but the point about it is there's some risks I just can't take.
Okay, thanks, Bill. One more and then we'll go to the slider on the floor.
I always wanted to say that in Kooyong. Good. That's a separate debate. Oh, and I've got no plans on that, okay, please. don't. No, dead.
You heard it here. Group homes. Concerns about the fact that since the, group homes were transferred from the, when we're talking about this transfer of responsibility from the state government to the NDIS, that it's more difficult to get daily living needs covered through rosters of care. And was it the intention of the NDIS that all community engagement and communication assistance would be individually funded? I guess there's some concerns about the negative impact of individualised funding models on group homes in particular.
Well, let's start beyond the borders of Kooyong and go to more remote and regional Australia. I like the idea of individualised funding, and I like the individuals having agency. But if you're in Longreach, or if you're in northwestern Tassie, or if you're on the Cape York Peninsula in South Australia, there's not 2,500 service providers. So somewhere along the line, it's no good giving a person a package that they can never use, or having a highly inefficient and expensive model of service delivery that you just fly in, fly out everyone. So I'm interested how we, if we know, for example, if there's 30 people who need meals prepared, or if there's 40 people in northwest Tassie around Burnie who are kids who need speech pathology, how can we say to, you know, the special school there, set up an NDIS service company, hire a couple of OTs, and we'll say that part of the package has to go to that service. So we want to make sure we maintain choice and control, but in an Aboriginal community in Port Hedland, which I visited, the Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, they've got 60 or 70 people on the NDIS. Frankly, we're better off saying to the ACCHO there, you hire another podiatrist, you hire an OT, you hire a speech pathologist, pay them well, get them to live there, and we'll just say that the common features of people's packages, that service will be used there, so you can guarantee the cash flow. So it's a hybrid model in a thin market. So that's one aspect which I think makes sense. In terms of group homes, I think I said in my opening, we know that they're not working quite as intended. We don't want to create many institutions, and we don't want to just have one size fits all. But the idea that we can supply one-on-one care 24 hours a day to tens of thousands of people, that isn't realistic either. So we're just going to have to work with individuals, we're going to have to work through their needs. I'm keen to see how we can assist people at their family homes and how we make it easier there. you know, and I get that there's rigidities in the system we have to question. You know, like, if you buy a new car, we might support you with that. But if you want to renovate, you know, remedy your old car, well, we can't do that. You know, I think we're just going to have to get bespoke, we have to get smart. So, but with group homes, we don't have all the answers yet. I'm deeply aware, though, that, and we're working on it, how do we make sure that we're not creating mini institutions? How do we make sure we're creating innovation and options for people, which isn't just one size fits all? But how do we also not make a promise that you can have indefinite one-to-one care for the rest of your life, when I'm not sure the system can sustain that indefinitely for everyone who wants it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to these questions and then I'll have... Stacey, did you have a question, sorry? No, okay, all right. So I'm not sure if you can see this. So support coordination, oh no, we'll talk about that. The review of the NDIS, is that looking at things like public service protocols, policies and training? There's some concerns here about confidentiality and privacy being breached at times.
In terms of how the NDIA operates, there's general principles which the review will look at, but in terms of the professionalism of protocols, that'll be a matter for the agency leadership and the Public Service Commissioner. If people have got complaints about breaches, they can forward them to my office. We can talk to the Public Service Commissioner. We can talk to the new leadership of the agency.
Thank you. We have a question here. Okay, so we'll start with this lady here.
Hello, my name is M, and the question is regarding the NDIS plan review. So I'm a mother of a 9-year-old who has a rare genetic condition as a participant of NDIA. So let's just say she's the rarest of them all. The question is, when the plan review happens, every single year we struggle to establish the eligibility. Even with a lot of reports from medical practitioners and GPs and pediatricians and therapists, it's still a struggle. And when the plan review happens, it's still a lot of deficit based, where I have to prove the deficit and deficit and deficit every year. The question is, where do these people stand? Like, and as Mr. Shorten earlier said, it's not like parents like me would like to have our kids in the system. So we would like to get the kids out of the system, but they still need the support at those critical points. So kids which do not have a label on them, like autism, ADHD or whatever, where do they stand and how could we, help them to access the support and get out of the system sooner rather than later?
What's your child's name?
Ishka.
Okay. Well, when Ishka and you present, the idea which occurred to me as you were speaking is it goes back to agency capability. When you're talking about a person or a participant with a rare condition, a lot of people who've talked to me about rare conditions feel that they're talking to people who have no idea what you are talking about. And I've heard some quite harrowing stories. I think the answer, and we'll see what the review says about it, but the answer is we've got to build policy depth with a whole range of conditions. Ishka's condition may be rare, but Ishka's not the only child or adult who will have a rare condition. And what you've got to do is have a team of people at the agency who you can be referred to really quickly. And you don't feel like you're translating a different language then, and then you can talk it through. I also think longer plans will take out some of the pain in this process too. But agency capability, I mean, again, I'm not being a brain surgeon saying it, but the more that the people you're talking to know what they're talking about, the more empathetic you can get, and we build up a body of knowledge. And longer plans also make sense, don't they, in that regard?
They really do. We'll come to just after this lady.
Hello. I'm rather notorious because I tend to complain a lot. Struggling to breathe is not considered a disability. I am a lifelong chronic asthmatic. The medication that I was given is no longer given to kids and caused a lot of long-term side effects that were permanent. I got NDIS under mental health. I don't recognise myself under the About Me section because that describes me as an imbecile. That makes me angry, it makes me frustrated, it does not help my mental health condition. My medication still affects my mental health condition, and the other day I sat for a couple of hours on my driveway deciding whether or not it was worth struggling inside. I can't get the services I need because, unfortunately, it's a mental health condition, not a physical disability.
This is why we've got to move away from pure diagnosis. The scheme, when it has pure diagnosis, can lead to outcomes which mean that people fall between the cracks. We've got the agency here. I don't mean to stretch you, but I would like them to chat to you separately so you can get individual attention. And when I make that offer, since I've become the minister, the agency makes decisions, but my office has handled 13,000 individual matters. Now, they haven't all been resolved to the satisfaction of people, but the agency doesn't get things as right as they should at the moment. That doesn't mean that you'll get a satisfactory outcome, but I'm saying that you as an individual matters, and for me that's not just rhetoric, because we're handling thousands of individuals, some of whom are not happy still, but others are. The thing generally about chronic illness, though, is chronic illness is something which the whole of the society lets fall between the cracks, in my opinion. There's a major issue in the health system as well about, we like people to fit into square boxes. But the reality is, people don't all fit into square boxes. It'll be a big box to fit me, and we just don't fit everyone into square boxes, and chronic illness is a classic example of that. There are tens of thousands of people on the scheme who have chronic illness, though. I mean, this is what I like about the NDIS. When you actually start getting into the data is people, but there's a whole lot of people who never... One of the big debates in Australia is the NDIS costs too much. Now, I think that we can moderate its growth, but I don't have a view about the scheme as being a cost per se. I think it's an investment. And I think what we've discovered in the last 10 years is there was a lot of unmet need. So, I found your story then quite moving. I'm sorry for the trauma you're going through and you have been through. We'll get the agency to talk to you individually as a person. Chronic illness, though, is not a bar to being on the scheme. And again, once I build some depth in the agency, then at least there'll be a group of people who build up a body of knowledge around chronic illness. And you don't sound like an imbecile at all. Not that you needed me to tell you that. We got a question time. We hear imbeciles.
It's true.
I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm going to say what I think. I'm a clinical psychologist, 20 years experience. I've been working with the NDIS for 5 years. I've become a bit of an advocate for my clients. Recently, I went to the tribunal for one of my clients. We won. However, a lot of money was wasted. One, because if I had been able to speak to somebody from the NDIA who had any knowledge about psychosocial disability and what it means, it probably would not have gotten to the AAT in the first place. Two, we have had multiple meetings at the tribunal, which I was paid a lot of money myself, which I think was a waste of time. I was asked to answer the same question over and over again in many different ways, and I wanted it written down in many different ways, and I got really exacerbated about that. And my client was really, really upset and stressed about the process. We insisted, but after a lot of money, wasted money for the government money, we got where we wanted, but it was a lot of stress for my client, a lot of stress for me, and a lot of waste of money for the government. And I think the problem that I see is when I speak to people, LICs, support coordinators, plan managers, we don't speak the same language.
No.
They do not understand where I'm coming from, and they totally disregard what I say. As a matter of fact, one of the things that came out of the tribunal, my client was allowed to get some low assistive technology. We applied for it to the plan manager. The plan manager refused to pay for it. I sent them letters of what the AAT people have said and the legal person from the NDIA had said. Totally disregarded it. They wanted us to talk to the local area coordinator. The local area coordinator, in this case, said no. We don't really have a say on it, but we do think it's unreasonable and necessary, even though I said to them that the tribunal had determined it to be reasonable and necessary. And up until today, she still hasn't got it. So there's a lot of money that she got, but we cannot use because we cannot communicate with the people. The system is amazing. I don't want to say it's not amazing. It has helped a lot of my clients, and it is an amazing idea. I just think we need more people that understand what disability is about. Even like support workers, I think they should have a minimum of Certificate 3. I see a lot of people, support workers, that have no qualifications whatsoever, that make my clients much worse when they try to help them than better.
Yeah, but what do you really think? You had nothing to be nervous about. I don't know about the rest of you. This probably just reflects an insecurity on my part. When someone says they're a clinical psychologist, I immediately feel like, don't read my mind. I think we're on the same page. And I'm sure you've been hearing what I've been saying. Sometimes the agency will make a decision which, frankly, they've got to make. You can't make everyone happy. And I don't want to be someone who promises you that will be the case, because then you know I was BSing you. But there have been some disputes which have gone on for so long when they should never have happened. I mean, I'll try and one-up your story, which makes you want to face palm. There was a big debate, went for 2.5 years, got to the AAT, about a participant seeking to get a CPAP machine, which helps them with their snoring. Anyway, 2.5 years, you can get it through Medic. You didn't need to be like it's already funded. But for 2.5 years, the participant and the agency fought each other about it. Like, that's just bad. So to the extent that if you feel better knowing that there's other idiotic disputes, I'm sure that doesn't make you feel better, actually. But again, a lot of it does come back to that basic proposition. If the agency capability is improved, then you stop arguing about stuff. If you're talking to someone who speaks the same language as you, at least you can understand it. Even if you get a rejection, you can understand it. We want to make sure that our internal review processes are better, though. If you disagree, you quite often, 86% of the people who ended up going to the AAT didn't have lawyers, and the NDIA always had one. So I don't believe in David and Goliath sort of struggles. I think that, first of all, the agency, it would only ever be at the final hearing that the old leadership of the agency would put reasons in writing. Now, how do you fight with something where you can't even see what the reasons are? So that's why I've had Ron McCallum, a range of Graham Innes, Natalie Wade, a range of Margaret Connell. These are all prominent disability advocates who I brought in just to review files. And also I gave an instruction within the agency, if we are fighting, spending more in the fight than we are that we're fighting about, I want you to reconsider why we're having the fight. You know, just stuff like that. I don't pretend that it's still seamless, and I'm sure that Monique's email page will light up, well, Bill said this, but I've got this fight, I've got that fight. I'm not pretending to everything's sorted, but I just want to bring a dose of common sense to the proceedings. And I really rate some of the new leadership of the agency. This Rebecca Falkingham I put in, she's the real deal. Kurt is the chair. Kurt's been fighting for disability rights ever since he was at school, and his teacher, he tells this moving story that someone told him he wouldn't amount to much, and you know, you should go to a day centre, you know. Fortunately, he had a good school principal and people who believed him. Now he holds more world records than this room will ever hold. Huh? Sorry for some of you hold world records, but like the tyranny of low expectations. So a dose of common sense goes a long way. But agency capability is a strong reform, clear guidelines. This is an issue, though, we found with robo-debt and the AAT generally, where there are, you can't print every decision, but where there's a decision which has implications, I think it's got to be published so people know the rules. Anyway, thanks for hanging in there.
I'm going to take one from the Slido, which has disappeared, but I remember the bulk of it. Thank you. You guys are doing an amazing job, by the way. I don't know if you've noticed these two. They're working their little...
Yeah, and I'm sorry for my bad jokes too.
Yeah, and the swear words.
Did I not sworn?
Yeah.
Did I?
Non-standard equipment and funding of non-standard equipment and not accessing things like that. People often tell us that they can't get things funded that they need, but also they could access things more cheaply than they can via the NDIA themselves. How can that be sort of fixed? I mean, someone was telling us the other day how they were forced to pay some ridiculous amount of money for a piece of equipment where really they could have gone to Kmart and done something more similar.
Well, again, this is where my ACCC regs are going to come in handy. We've got to stop price gouging. Like things like a shower chair. You go online, it's like $100 or $130. Then when you put the magic 4 letters NDIS shower chair, it magically quadruples in price. Yeah, that's right. It's ridiculous. Well, so that's one thing. It is ridiculous, and we just got to stop that. And I need to give the best ally I'm going to have in stopping it is people with disability and their families. And I just want to get you a regulation which you can laminate. The millennials will not understand what laminating means. Tell them it's sort of a pre-app app, and you've got it there and you whip it out and you just say to people, you can't do this. But the other thing is, there's low-hanging fruit here which just haven't been done. I'm a believer in e-markets. You can go on, you can Google up, you can go on Airbnb or you can go on TripAdvisor and it sort of sorts out prices for you. But in disability world, we just don't have those same tools, and it shouldn't be that hard to develop that. So we're going to get the agency to invest in some positive tools which give consumers power. It's there to be done. And the beauty is we don't have to invent it. Someone else has. We just have to apply it to our world. So I think that'll make a big difference too. That's positive, pro-competition.
So speaking of accessibility, a few people have commented on the fact that all formal correspondence to the NDIS goes to a general PO box, which that can be a problematic, particularly when people are breaching the 21-day time target and having applications denied.
Yeah, that's ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah.
I share your frustration, not because of dealing with the NDIS, but when you're on the phone, and believe it or not, politicians periodically live in the real world, when you're on the phone, you ring someone and you can't get through to them, then they ring you back, it's an unknown number, you never have a number to ring them, a direct number. We've just made a couple of basic changes already in my correspondence to anyone. I'm doing it for Services Australia as well. When we write to you, we say, if you don't like what we've said, this is Jenny and this is her mobile number. Like, you've got to have a way of penetrating the system, which is not just anonymous walls. There's no doors in the system. And I know the agency, it's not all going to change overnight, but I know the leadership of the agency is deeply conscious that you want a person to ring back. You just don't want a general switchboard. And if you ring someone, you'd like to know they know what they're doing, that you're going to get a human. But I'll take on board that question about the GPO box and all of that. We're trying to get to a system, once there's more people in the agency, where you can write back to a person's direct address. One of the things, though, which is a nightmare, is when you write to one person, they've gone, that doesn't get passed on to the next person, and it just becomes a nightmare. Anyway, whilst the solution seems easy, I've still got to find enough money in the budget to put on more people. At the end of the day, you cannot run superior systems with declining numbers of people where the ratio gets out of whack. You need more humans in the system. Now, I've got this general challenge in Services Australia because they're great people, but the demand is going nuts. In the NDIA, we've had some wins, and in the Safeguards Commission, we're almost doubling their workforce. There's still a lot of demand, but I get the need to have a human to talk to at some point, because that's how you engender accountability.
It's not just the human bit, it's that if you've got inquiries and applications just going to the one email address.
I'll repeat it.
Yeah, if you've got an inquiries at NDIA for your applications.
Here's a mic. Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay.
That, so all formal documentation always comes back with that unregulated GPO box 7,000 in Canberra, and you can have documents sitting there for a while, but also applications and inquiries all just go through and inquiries at general email address.
Yeah.
So rather than have applications separate, if you had a plan manager, they wouldn't have one email address for invoices and inquiries. They separate it. So you're never going to meet your KPIs for your 21 days under Section 48 and all that. And if you just have one option.
I think that's a really useful point. I don't have the answer tonight on that. Not that I had the answer and everything else, but I genuinely will just take that on notice. It's not the current leadership, but one of the previous leadership, I rang up in about August of last year and I said, the complaints line of the agencies hangs up on you when you ring it. You go for it, you sit on it for a couple of minutes, and then it cuts you off. And I'd received this correspondence from someone, I said, oh, that couldn't be right. And so I rang it up myself, and it happened. And then I just checked that I hadn't, so I did it again, it happened again. So I rang someone very senior who's no longer with the organisation. I said, do you know this is happening? I said, no, that couldn't be happening. I said, I'm telling you it's happening. I'm only smiling, but it's not a funny matter. So I hear what you say about the GPO box, the inquiries line, and we'll take that on board, and I'll relay that to the agency. I do actually think the new leadership they get this issue. I mean, they will understand it if they're not already onto it, but thank you for that.
We'll have three more questions, I think.
Thank you for being with us tonight. I am a NDIS participant. It's a simple plan, the supply of orthopaedic boots. It became necessary to submit a complaint to the Quality and Safeguard Commission. On first reading, they rejected my complaint, saying, oh, there's a use of a subcontractor, nothing to do with us, go to Consumer Affairs Victoria. Consumer Affairs Victoria said to me in no uncertain terms, Alan, your NDI plan managed, your service provider's service agreement makes absolutely no reference to an undocumented use of a subcontractor. This is a problem for the Quality and Safeguards Commission. To date, the Quality and Safeguards Commission have maintained this position. They are not in the position, nor do they think it necessary, to assess and review a service agreement. Why is this so?
Doesn't make sense to me. What's the actual complaint? Tell me about the actual complaint, if you've got time. Yeah.
2 pairs of shoes were needed to be made. I did not know the cobbler, the subcontractor involved, so there's always design modification to be made. The subcontractor was sending up invoices to the service provider, which were impinging on her profit margin. She told the subcontractor to stop working on your Mark 1 boots and get making on the Mark 2, the second pair of boots. Both set of boots have problems, and the problem has not been resolved because the service provider would not allow the subcontractor, the undocumented subcontractor, to properly resolve the initial designs of the boots.
Your point's really well made. Let's pursue your matter with the Safeguards Commission, and I will ask them to explain to me why it's not their business. then I will ask them, if it's genuinely not their business, to point to me where legislatively they can't pursue it. And if they can point to me that there's a legislative loophole, then we will fix it. That's also proof I can give a short answer, anyway. But let's just, Daniel, is Daniel in the room? See Daniel behind you. He'll take your details, and Natasha's here too. We will, I mean, obviously we'll keep Monique's office in the loop, but we'll raise this matter with the Safeguards Commission, and I want them to tell me in fine print why they can't fix it.
Firstly, I'm nervous, but thank you both for your time. I'm the sister of 2 disabled brothers. One is in supported independent living. One of my biggest concerns, we've had lots of concerns we've spoken to Monique about, day programs, losing funding, in particular with independent living, keeping him at home for appointments, unnecessary paperwork and things like that. They can then take more money, and the day programs then can't claim money.
Which is...
They're already starting to merge. Now, these day programs are imperative for these
crucial.
people to get out. So my concern is what's going to happen for day programs if these supported places keep price gouging, so to speak.
I worry that, and this goes back to this housing conundrum, where there's a lot of very good support independent living providers. I've always got to say that whenever I'm about to criticise, most are good. But I worry that sometimes SIL operators have learned to engineer their rosters down to the, you know, with a degree of mathematical precision, which could have put them in the Oppenheimer film. You know, they really know what they're doing, but that's not what they're about. That's not what they should be about. I'm a big fan of day programs. So why don't we take your matter offline so I can understand it better? But I get, your instinct will be right. There's something going on, and at the end of the day, if you remember in my introduction, I said the test should always be, what's in the best interest of the participant? And the social engagement's crucial. We're going to have the Disability Royal Commission come down at the end of September. I think that's going to be complex. I think it's going to reveal things. It's been going for 4.5 years. It's cost hundreds of millions of dollars. I think it's going to make some very important exposures of things. I think it'll be uncomfortable, but I also think it's going to go to some pretty tough debates, and I'm not sure where the community will land. Supported employment, special schools. There are some people who say they should be shut, and there's others who say, whoa, they're there because, frankly, if they weren't there, then people wouldn't have the opportunities they do. So I am a supporter of day programs, and occasionally I hear turbulence in the system about various changes, making them less cost-effective, more cost-effective. That's slightly separate to the SIL issue, but I just wanted to raise it because I'm sure some will be thinking it. I also try and wrap my head around charge rates for day programs. I can think of at least a couple of problems which we haven't solved. One is, if you're running a day program and someone's sick, they don't get funded for it. But when your kid goes to school, the school doesn't lose the funding for your child when your kid's sick. And I'm not comparing people at day programs to children, I'm just saying the notion of government funding if someone's not there. By the same token, I sometimes hear of stories where service providers now do one-on-one because that's better than the effort to funding a group activity, where it's more effort to make the same margin. So I get the day programs, we've just got to keep working through how we do it.
Okay, I think the lady...
We've got next in line over here.
Okay, I think this is our last question. And then we'll talk about it.
Like everyone else, I'm nervous as well, and I hope I don't get emotional because it's... So, sorry, I'm going to get emotional.
Too late.
We've had a... I'm sure it's not the first time. I have a 10-year-old boy, so we were brought into the scheme through Kuyong when it came on, and we were under the old scheme. Now, I guess that was, I don't know, 7 years ago, maybe a little. I'm not sure how long, but it feels like a while. So to say that we were in the teething problem stage is an understatement. And what that's done for me has left me traumatised to the point where suddenly we have somehow slipped under the radar with our plan, and in a good sense for me, because we just our plan extends, and I'm happy to keep it where it is. I fought really hard to get that, and I don't know how many parents come to you at a certain point and say that we were told you won't get support worker hours. I should preface to say my child also has a very rare genetic condition. However, when we came onto the scheme, back then genetic testing wasn't where it is now in Australia, what was provided, I think, under the Medicare rebate that came in. So we had a diagnosis of cerebral palsy. According to the NDIS, that's still the case. His genetic condition that he does have, he's severe intellectual disability, he's non-verbal, he'll be dependent on us for life. So from my understanding, the fear that I have is discussing that rare genetic condition. Cerebral palsy, and I know this sounds terrible, but it ticked a box for us, and it made it a simpler from the people coming. The local area coordinator experience that we had was terrible. The one plan after the next, it was really terrible. From the beginning, where our first planner didn't even know what the orthotics were, didn't know what orthotic footwear was. We had no AFOs written into our plan. His feet are just, So what I guess what I'm looking for is some reassurance. So what I've done over the years is I treat our plan like it's, I treat it like it's our personal budget. I really respect that money. Yeah. And when people talk about the sustainability of the system, I'm like, I'm ready. Hey, you need some mums in there to tell you how to save some money. Like, if I can get nappies from the supermarket for him, as long as I can, that's what I do. Because that money that I save there, I can use somewhere else. But I guess what happens is that because AT is such a specialised area, I think he needs to have a specialised... He could do with a specialised bike, tricycle type, which, as you know, I'm sure, are very expensive. Oh, yeah. However, I just make do without, because I don't want to upset what's happening right now. Because the fear that I have, and I'm sure there's many people that you carry this weight when it comes to a certain time of the year that's coming. And I used to go at it like I'm going to court, I'm going to war. I have to have so much documentation. And I learnt quickly that's, like you said, a full-time job. And, the people that were supposed to be, support coordinators, etc., sometimes you feel like you know more than those people. And the planners would come and say, no, you can't have that. And the only way that I could fight to get the thing that he needed was gathering plans luckily from a couple of other parents that I knew who had accessed those items and said, this child has, and they've similar needs. And so then they said, they would deny you before they would actually even take it to the NDIA. So I just am, so afraid to upset the apple cart, so to speak, with our current plan. Now, his needs will obviously grow as he gets older. But I'm stuck at the moment, and I don't know, it's just one of those things that I feel like we're coping where we are, but we fought really hard to even get that support in terms of even having a support worker hours to come into our home. And parents like us have to go on a long journey. I think to assume that parents of children all children are needing care. Well, I have a neurotypical daughter, so I know the level of care that's required for her at the same age. And I think burnout of parents, and I see so many other parents of younger children, and especially with their complex needs. And what I would like to know is, given that he has this diagnosis, can that not be factored in somewhere so that the NDIA can recognise this is his condition? He has a severe intellectual disability. That's not going to change. Can we not traumatise these parents every year? And I know you're talking about longer plans, and I don't know what the parameters around that will be. But that's the position that we're in, and I carry that load, and I feel very responsible for, for his care and our family overall, the care to get, the help that we get through the NDIS. And I am very grateful, but I fought really hard to get to this point. Yeah.
What's your son's name? And what's your first name? Okay, thanks for that. I actually think somehow you've done the whole room a favour. You've, I think, summarised a lot of the good and the bad and the feeling and the passion of what matters. I literally wrote down about 9 things which flashed through my mind as you were talking so powerfully. First of all, imagine life without the scheme. That's the first thing, and that's why I'm so fierce for it.
And that's why that's my greatest fear. Every time as a person, even doctors will say it to us, this scheme is going to...
I know, and so that's why I'm going to go to my second... That's why I'm going to go to my... I actually have written down language is crucial. I groan every time I do a press conference or I hear someone say, the scheme's blah, 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 and because I think, whoa. I always say, the scheme's here to stay. Now, I think I've educated... The political class isn't as NDIS literate as you'd hope. The people sitting opposite, not quite as NDIS literate as the people who sit behind me.
What if the Liberals get in, though?
They won't.
Well, there's an answer to that. There's an answer to that.
Not for a while.
That's on you and everyone you can talk to. But let's not go to the disaster scenarios yet. Let's just... the scheme... we're determined to keep it. Language is crucial. I wish some of the people who complain about the scheme could have heard you then. But this is where it becomes a little challenging. There are rorts. There are the people taking a lend of the scheme, and I always feel bad when I talk about the rorts, not because I like the rorts, but because there's so many legitimate people on the scheme that when you talk about the problems, you're sort of, it's scary. But I feel that if we take control as a sector of dealing with the bad actors, then we actually protect the scheme for all the good people who need it. So I guess it's just being truthful, isn't it? But it's always starting off, I think we need to moderate the rate of growth of the scheme. But I think we do that so we can have the scheme in the best interests of Tennyson and everyone else on the scheme. Like for me, sustainability is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. The end is having a world-class scheme which provides package support. Another thing that went through my mind as you were speaking is I honestly think the best person to allocate the resources for Tennyson is you. So one of the things, watching the reform, how do we make it more fungible? That's it's a fancy term, but some of you know what it means. Others will want to say why you're saying that. At the moment, you've got your 3 categories and you've got your line items. I want to make that a lot more trusting you. You know what Tennyson needs. So once we've got a budget and a plan, I just want to make it, I don't want you to have to go and check when you need to change something for a couple $100. I think the quid pro quo, and we can do it, is I think the agency needs in real time to see how your plan budget's going. If it's getting depleted, if there's a lot of invoices coming in, we need to know before it goes into the red. But with that general real-time ability to just make sure there's nothing untoward, unexpected happening, I would rather you have a lot more control over the budget. And the whole aim to give an individual and a family a say wasn't then to have the agency micromanaging a lot of these decisions. You're the resource allocator. No one knows your kid better than you. So that's something else that we want you to have greater control. Longer, we'll do it by co-design, but we're thinking 5 years. Now, maybe the sector or people come back and say that's too long or too short, whatever. I don't think it'll be any longer than that. But I want to have a longer period of time, not, because what happens now, as you know, is you get these year plans, and because the organisation's so stretched, they can't make a decision, so they'll roll you over for 3-month plans. Like, the agency has become, a few years ago, had become a byword in micromanaging decisions. You know, you get quarter of a year plans. That's just the definition of just ludicrousness. Let's keep in touch. I don't want you feeling traumatised. I do get that it's scary. We want this review to work, but I hope tonight you get a sense that the place that we're coming from, and people like Monique will keep us honest, is to see the scheme go for a long, long, long time. And yes, I can't control every economic journalist who wants to say it'll be X% of GDP by 2063, although I love seeing some of these numbers. You know, I love it because, you know, some of us won't even be here in 2063. So I love when it comes to the NDIS, we're thinking in the future, whereas normally the share market operates on day by day, but the NDIS, we've got to prove a 40-year return on investment. I mean, this is going to, I say this sort of to amuse you, sort of to make you groan, but sort of relieve you. It's not the prevailing view. There was a young man who was 17. He's going to go to law school. An application of a guide dog. The agency was contesting it. And they said, well, he's 17. If he gets a dog now, he'll need 10 dogs over the next 60 years. It'll cost $1 million. I said, well, he's going to make 10 million. You're going to pay 3 million in tax. And I said, why is it that this kid and this guide dog are getting a test applied to it, an Australian public investment? No one gets. So I think what I'm really trying to say to you is, let's make the scheme work as it's meant to. Let's take some of the fear and trauma out of it. Let's put some predictability back into it. Let's make sure, and then that way we can actually take it out of the day-to-day political football field, and people say, a bit like Medicare, you kind of, I want it up there with Medicare, that no one, and that goes to the question by the lady in yellow, I want to make the scheme not unaccountable, but not a political football where if you worry about who's in power, will it all get slashed to buggery? But that's on all of us. That's why tonight's good. That's why it's good that you've got Monique Ryan in Parliament. And with your Senate vote. But you've also got a Senate vote, just saying, you know, we can all get a win. But most seriously, thank you.
And on that note, I wanted to, Bill, thank you, and come and talk to us in the office. You know, we're here for these sorts of things. It's exactly the sort of thing that my wonderful team members who are still here are here for. I'd like to thank Melissa Martin and Kelly North, who've been wonderful translators. I'd like to thank my team and Bill's team and the members of the NDIA who are still here now.
Thank you.
I want to call out that dog who is very cute and extremely well behaved and has been giving me little warm feelings. Well, you did good. But most of all, I would like to thank the Minister for an extremely generous use of his time this evening. I think I can speak for the rest of my team. We feel really strongly about the NDIS, and we're very, very happy to have this gentleman in charge of it. And I think he will do right by us. I know he cares about it, and that is a nice thing to know. So thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well done.
Well done. Thank you.